My name is Ann Chesky-Smith, and I'm the Executive Director at the Western North Carolina Historical Association in Asheville, North Carolina. This webinar is the second in a series of 3 on the South Asheville Cemetery, the oldest public cemetery for African American burials in Western North Carolina. Last time we talked about the origins of the cemetery. You may remember that in this 2-acre area of land, there are around 2,000 graves. Of these, less than 100 have engraved markers. But that does not mean that we don't know who's buried there. As we speak, Linda Brown, who retired from the Buncombe County Tax Office, is finalizing a publication on the cemetery in which, primarily through death certificates, she has located the names of over 2,000 people who were buried at South Asheville. Devastatingly, many of them were stillborn children. She has highlighted the story of one family, the Baileys, in an excerpt from the publication, which will be featured in an upcoming issue of A Lot of Old Buncombe from the Old Buncombe County Genealogical Society. At the Western North Carolina Historical Association, we have also been researching the people who were laid to rest at the South Asheville Cemetery, but we took a different approach, starting with the earliest records we have, which note the names and some of the family relationships of the people who may be buried there. The South Asheville Cemetery was founded in the early 1800s as a burial ground for people who had been enslaved by the Smith family, the first family to live in what is currently known as the Smith-McDowell House, a circa 1840s brick mansion that is now home to the Western North Carolina Historical Association. The house and the cemetery eventually came into the possession of one of the Smith daughters, who married a McDowell. With such a close association between our facility and the cemetery, we began a project to try to uncover the names and the stories of people who may have been buried in the cemetery. It is a common misconception that the histories of enslaved people have been lost to time. Many records do still exist and can be used to piece together family histories. It starts with putting in the time and the effort to find these records, but it also depends upon those that have the records to strive to make them as accessible as possible. If you've done any genealogical research, you've likely looked at census data, which in 2021 is accessible through the 1940 census on sites like Ancestry or Family Search. However, enslaved people were not referred to by name in the U.S. Census, so though we have records of the number of people who someone may have enslaved during a census year and their ages and sexes, we don't know their names, occupations, or family relationships. For instance, according to the census in 1850, the Smiths enslaved 44 people, 30 who were male and 14 who were female, and they were between the ages of 1 and 66 years old. Smith also had an agent who enslaved an additional 22 people. But what we do have is the last will and testament of the Smith patriarch, which lists the names of most of the people he enslaved between 1850 and his death in 1856. Working from this document, we are able to begin to trace the lives of those he enslaved as well as their ancestors and their descendants. In his will, Smith bequeaths by name people to his children. He sometimes identifies their occupation and or their family relationships. In an 1854 addendum to his will, Smith writes, "I give to the said Sarah L. McDowell, a Negro woman Rebecca, and her child Charlotte, which I purchased of William W. McDowell and placed in her possession." Though at first glance this seems like relatively little information, there's more here than it might seem. Here's what we know from that statement. Rebecca is Charlotte's mother. Charlotte is likely relatively young, as Smith refers to her as a child. If she were older and more independent, she likely would not have been paired with her mother. We also know that Rebecca and Charlotte may have been purchased between this 1854 amendment to Smith's will and his previous amendment, which was in 1851, as he had not referred to either a Rebecca or a Charlotte in any previous versions of his will. So why would Smith have placed Rebecca in the possession of his daughter, Sarah McDowell? One reason may have been that Rebecca's husband, Charlotte's father, was enslaved by the McDowells, Because children took the status of their mother, it would have been in Smith's financial best interest to allow Rebecca to reside with her husband. Each child that Rebecca gave birth to would increase Smith's wealth. Let's follow that thread for a moment. Could Rebecca have married a man enslaved by the McDowells? One incredible resource that we now have digital access to is the Buncombe County Register of Deeds, which includes digitized cohabitation records. In 1866, formerly enslaved people had to register any marriages that had occurred while they were enslaved to make these marriages legal in the eyes of the government. If we search the cohabitation records, we find 3 Rebeccas in Buncombe County. One, who has no last name listed, has been married to a man named James McDowell since 1842. Is this the same Rebecca? Possibly. It was fairly common for a formerly enslaved person to be referred to by the last name of their former enslaver, even if they had a different last name at the time. So let's keep digging. The first census that names people who were once enslaved is the 1870 U.S. Census. If we search for a mother-daughter relationship in the 1870 Buncombe County Census, we find one African-American family with a mother named Rebecca and a daughter named Charlotte. And guess what Rebecca's husband's name is? James. But their last name is not McDowell, it's Bailey. This still feels like a thread we need to follow. In the 1870 census, Rebecca is listed as 44, James is 54, and Charlotte is 20, which would put Charlotte's birth date around 1850, which fits well with our assumption that she was likely quite young when Smith wrote her into his will in 1854. James is working as a brick mason, Rebecca is keeping house, and Charlotte is working in a home as a domestic servant. If we keep tracing the Baileys, we find them again in the 1880 census, living on South Main Street, as well as in the Asheville city directories in the 1880s. In 1884, the McDowells sold over 11 acres of land to a James and Rebecca Bailey not far from the Smith McDowell house. This land is on McDowell Street. This connection between the families begins to cement in my mind that Rebecca and Charlotte Bailey are the same Rebecca and Charlotte who were once enslaved by the Smiths and the McDowells. Around the same time that they sold land to the Baileys, the McDowells, who were in debt, also sold the Smith McDowell house, and they moved to South Main Street. Rebecca and Charlotte again appear in the 1900 census, but Rebecca, now 75, is listed as a widow. It's important to note that most of the 1890 U.S. Census was lost in a 1921 fire, so one of the best records we have of people in Asheville during that time period is the Asheville City Directories, another resource that is available digitally. The last directory that we see James Bailey listed in is 1887. So we don't know specifically when he died, but it is possible that he is the James G. Bailey who has the engraved marker with the earliest date of death in the South Asheville Cemetery. It's more likely, however, that his headstone is this of James Bailey Sr., who died at 80 years old in 1896. After James's death, Charlotte and her mother continued to reside on McDowell Street. Charlotte even purchased a 1-acre parcel of land from her parents for $5 in 1889. But in 1896, when Charlotte defaulted on a loan, 3/4 of that acre went up for public auction. It was purchased for $260 by the highest bidder, Sarah Lucinda McDowell. Likely at this point there was at least one home built on the property. It does appear that Charlotte and her mother continued to reside at their home on McDowell Street even after Sarah McDowell repurchased the land. The last city directory that we see Rebecca listed in is the 1900-1901 directory. It's likely she died around 1902. She may also be buried at the South Asheville Cemetery. The gap of about 15 years between Rebecca and James's death may also explain why James's grave is marked but Rebecca's is not. By the time of Rebecca's death, the Baileys appear to be in a more dire financial position. There are several other Bailey family members with engraved markers at South Asheville, all who died between 1886 and 1888. Charlotte worked at various jobs around Asheville as a washerwoman and then as a cook at a boarding house. After her mother's death, Charlotte moved to New York City, where she died in 1905 of cancer. She was buried in Evergreen Cemetery in New York. On her death certificate, her mother's maiden name is listed as Greenlee. So we've now been able to document a few more likely occupants of the South Asheville Cemetery. But perhaps more importantly, we've uncovered a bit of their stories. We've primarily looked at their lives after 1865 when they gained their freedom, but it seems very likely that prior to 1865, all three of them, Rebecca, James, and Charlotte, were enslaved by the Smith and McDowell families. If that is indeed the case, here's what we've been able to piece together about their lives prior to 1865. James Bailey was born into slavery around 1816. He was likely born at Pleasant Gardens, a plantation in Burke County, North Carolina, which was owned by James McDowell. When James Bailey was about 7 years old, James McDowell had a son, William, who would one day become James Bailey's owner. By 1840, James McDowell enslaved 27 people, but was in debt. To help settle some of these debts, in 1842, he sold 15 to 20 of the people he enslaved. This was the same year, 1842, that James Bailey and Rebecca married. Rebecca was around 16 years old. Despite this sale, the couple appears to have been able to stay together as they had their first child, Charles, in 1843. It seems likely that both James and Rebecca were part of the group of about 12 enslaved people who stayed at Pleasant Gardens after the sale. In 1845, James and Rebecca Bailey had another son, Isaiah. Around 1848, James McDowell moved to Yancey County to remarry after his wife's death and deeded Pleasant Gardens to his brother-in-law. It appears that all the people he enslaved traveled to Yancey County with him. It seems likely that James and Rebecca and their sons Charles and Isaiah were part of this group. James McDowell's son William, who was now in his mid-20s, married Sarah Lucinda Smith. Now living in Buncombe County, William exchanged letters with his father about a man called Jim in the early 1850s. James McDowell wrote to his son, "You write me that you want me to put a price on boy Jim. My son, I don't know what to say. If I had the wherewith, I would not part with him at no price. You may have him for 700. I want the bank and Whitson paid and the balance. And such things as I stand in need of, sugar and coffee, and perhaps a little money to pay my taxes occasionally." In a follow-up letter, James McDowell continues, "I have a pretty little girl that I could spare, but Jim does not like Yancey, and I will let him try some other country. And he wants to go to Buncombe, and he shall go if I only get half price." Unfortunately, at this time, we only have a transcription of the letter, which does not include the date it was written, nor the full details of either letter. It's unclear whether Jim and James Bailey are the same person. But this does give us a possible path of how James may have come to Buncombe County. From the records we do have, it seems likely that at least part of the Bailey family came to live in Buncombe County in the early 1850s. Though they were enslaved by the Smiths, they lived with the McDowells, as noted in Smith's will. In 1856, Smith died. A year later, the McDowells moved to what is now the Smith-McDowell House, the first family to live there full-time. It is likely that at least Rebecca and Charlotte came along with the family to the brick mansion. James and Rebecca likely lived together as a couple because they continued to have children. Hannah, around 1854, Alcee in 1857, James Jr. in 1859, and Pink in 1862. So perhaps James resided with his family in one of the 6 slave dwellings that the McDowells owned, according to the 1860 census. It seems that Rebecca and James and all their children continued to be enslaved by the McDowells, James perhaps working as a brick mason and Rebecca doing household chores until they gained their freedom around April 1865. Most of this story was pieced together using records that are available digitally and at no cost. However, some of the most important pieces, like Smith's will or the McDowell family letters, are more difficult to find and even harder to access. But you can help. Utilize the records that are available to begin a research project of your own. Donate to archives, either in time or in money, to help them make more items digitally available. It's a time-consuming process to digitize and catalog archival records. It can also be prohibitively expensive. There are also a number of websites where you can volunteer your time to transcribe historic records from home. Computers can do some great things, but reading old-timey cursive handwriting is not yet one of them. To find out more about the South Asheville Cemetery, visit southashevillecemetery.net. And to find out more about the Western North Carolina Historical Association, visit wnchistory.org. In the final webinar of this series, we'll look at the closing of the cemetery in the 1940s and what's been happening at the cemetery since it closed.